College scholarships in the name of George Floyd. 5 years later, a look at what we found when we started asking questions. Next. Mark Perry has been asking questions on this very topic for years. Mark, you're a graduate of the University of Minnesota. You went on to become an economics professor at the University of Michigan, and you are also an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Appreciate you joining me to talk about this. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Liz.
I know you care about the state of Minnesota and the state of affairs, Mark, and I think we know a lot more about what happened with George Floyd than we did back in May of 2020. But some colleges and universities still seem to hold him up as some kind of hero, despite the facts and mandates to dismantle DEI. For example, just recently, St. Catherine University magazine, published by a private Catholic school in St. Paul, wrote about the yearly George Floyd Memorial Endowment Scholarship. After asking questions, the school provided a statement to Alpha News saying the history and values of St. Catherine University and our founders inspired a response to the call for racial justice, and that the scholarship established with a donor's gift is an answer to this call and fuels St. Kate's mission of education as an expression of social justice. As a former professor yourself and someone pushing back against DEI in education, you have filed 10 civil rights complaints about this very subject, these George Floyd Memorial Scholarships. Tell us about these complaints, Mark, and why this has been so important to you.
Yeah, and this is really an important national issue. And one thing that's important about it is that this trend of the George Floyd Memorial Scholarships started in Minnesota, as you know, at North Central University, which hosted the first of 3 funeral or memorial services for George Floyd back in 2020. And at that memorial service at North Central University in downtown, close to Hennepin County Medical Center, the president at that time said at that service that he was introducing a George Floyd Memorial Scholarship at North Central University in downtown Minneapolis exclusively for Black students, which again it's completely illegal to do that. And yet he announced this at the memorial service. And not only did he announce that he was starting a George Floyd scholarship for Black students only at North Central, he challenged every other college president in the country to follow his lead and introduce George Floyd scholarships across the country, which dozens of universities and colleges did follow his lead. Now, the problem is that in terms of Title VI, which is the federal law that protects individuals against discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin, there are no exceptions if you have, let's say, good intentions, which is clearly the case here. But the Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1964 clearly says that if you're a recipient of federal funds, federal funding, which North Central is and most other universities are, that then you have a legal obligation as a condition of accepting federal funding. You have a legal obligation, and you have to certify to the Department of Education as a condition of getting the federal funds, which include research grants, Pell grants for students, federally insured student loans. You have to agree that you accept the funding. You have to agree to actively enforce all federal civil rights laws, which include discrimination on the basis of race, sex, disability, and age. And yet these universities like North Central, they accept federal funding, and then they announce publicly at a memorial service for George Floyd that their intent is to violate Title VI and start issuing scholarships on the basis of race to exclusively for Black students at North Central, and not only doing it themselves, but then encouraging every other college in the country to follow that lead and also engage in illegal race-based discrimination. And so after that, service in 2020, at least 10 other, there was dozens of other universities that introduced George Floyd Memorial Scholarships, including many in Minnesota, including at University of Minnesota and Bethel and Metropolitan State and Hamlin and St. Kate's, and along with other universities all over the Midwest and all over the country. And now, if they said that the scholarship was for students who had some kind of dedication to either racial justice or social justice, that would be okay. So if it was not racially exclusionary, it would be legal. But many of the universities, including North Central and Bethel and Hamlin and St. Kate's, introduced scholarships that were exclusively for Black students only, which is a clear violation of Title VI. So then it just kind of illustrates that higher education is really in some ways a corrupt and unprincipled enterprise, because they accept federal funding, they agree to enforce Title IX and Title VI and federal civil rights laws, then they actively violate federal civil rights laws. And so this is where I took it upon myself, along with some other people, to really start challenging any university that's violating Title VI or violating Title IX. And so after North Central introduced their scholarship, as soon as it was active, because it took about a year, they raised some money, and for Office for Civil Rights, a civil rights complaint has to have demonstrated discrimination within the last 180 days. So it took about a year into 2021 before North Central finally had a website for the George Floyd Memorial Scholarship with the eligibility stated explicitly that it was for Black students only. And so I immediately filed a Title VI complaint with the Office for Civil Rights against North Central. And then as other universities followed, including, Bethel and University of Minnesota and St. Kate's and so on, and other universities outside of Minnesota, I started filing Title VI complaints against any university that was using race as an exclusionary basis for eligibility for a George Floyd scholarship. And so in total, I filed about 10 civil rights complaints for universities that were violating Title VI.
I know ultimately 2 of your complaints were not considered violations of Title VI. I want to talk more about the University of Minnesota in a moment. But first, I want our viewers to listen to what the Carlson School Dean had to say about the school's George Floyd Scholarship. This is 4 years ago. Take a listen.
Today, I'm announcing one important step on that journey with the creation of the Carlson School of Management Scholarship in honor of George Floyd. This scholarship will enhance the diversity of the student body and has a preference for Black and African American students, as well as those who have financial need or are victims of police violence, for as long as they are underrepresented at the Carlson School.
Again, we asked questions, and the U of M told us in a statement that the scholarship is, quote, on hold now. You've also found, Mark, that many schools are no longer accepting donations. Do you get the sense that people are finally waking up?
Yeah, I think what happened is that there was this big burst of activity and interest in George Floyd scholarships, underrepresented in medicine scholarships, race-based scholarships after George Floyd. And so there was a flurry of kind of activity announcing race-based scholarships, including George Floyd Memorial scholarships, for the next couple of years. But I think as those were challenged, and 5 of the George Floyd scholarships that I challenged were changed, including at Hamlin and Bethel University locally here in Minnesota, where they agreed to change the eligibility to accept all students regardless of their race, color, or national origin. And so what has happened, I think, over time is that there's been less and less of an interest. In fact, as we talked about, I think before, that University of Minnesota, it seems like they've either discontinued some of their George Floyd scholarships or they're no longer accepting funding for the George Floyd scholarships. So I think that universities over time have kind of really realized that they're on shaky legal ground when they're restricting scholarships on the basis of race, including the George Floyd scholarship. So I think really there's been a trend now towards either discontinuing the scholarships or opening the scholarships to all students. And that's what happened at North Central University finally last year. They changed it from the George Floyd Memorial Scholarship to the Floyd Scholarship. And they changed eligibility from a race-based eligibility to now they accept any student who has demonstrated some kind of, experience in leadership or something kind of, vague like that. And so what's happened is that some schools have been challenged and they've had to change. Other schools, I think, have realized that this is no longer something that the public wants and the students want, and faculty and alumni and parents. And so I think there's really been a decline in interest in promoting George Floyd, a career criminal and felon and drug addict, as somebody that college students should really look up to. And so I think that's been a big change over the last couple of years, especially this year in a new administration.
Your work hasn't stopped there. You've filed nearly 1,000 complaints so far with the Office of Civil Rights. Just for a sense of perspective, how bad are things here in Minnesota, Mark, given many of the Marxist, radical, and flatly racist programs we've covered over the years?
Well, Minnesota is really, in some ways, the leader in fraud, which has been, really been in the news lately. And in terms of, the universities in Minnesota, especially the University of Minnesota, I would describe their behavior as academic fraud in many ways. And the University of Minnesota is one of the worst serial violators of federal civil rights laws in the entire country. And of the 1,000 complaints that I've filed against probably more than 900 schools, I filed 28 individual complaints against the University of Minnesota for their continued ignoring, their legal obligation to enforce Title IX and Title VI. So it's really a disgrace, I think, and a disappointment. And as a U of M alumni, it's embarrassing that I've had to challenge the University of Minnesota on 28 different occasions for their continued and widespread and systemic violations of Title VI and Title IX, where they just seem committed to ignoring their obligation to enforce federal civil rights laws, and they just seem committed to discriminating on the basis of sex against men and discriminating on the basis of race against whites and Asians. So it's really, I think, something important that should be addressed and should be an embarrassment in the state of Minnesota that this has been so widespread and systemic at our our kind of, flagship university, a public university in Minnesota, that is just continuing to ignore their legal obligation to enforce Title IX and Title VI. And that's where I would describe it almost as academic fraud.
If parents or students have a problem with DEI-related scholarships or other programs, what do you suggest they do?
Well, if parents, alumni, students, faculty, any just private citizen who is aware of a program that discriminates on the basis of race or sex, they could bring it to my attention through my Twitter account, or they could contact me, I guess, through Alpha News. But I'd be happy to evaluate any individual's concern about a violation of Title IX or Title VI. And also it includes K through 12 public schools and public school systems. They're also under obligation to enforce Title IX and Title VI. So if any individual, parent, student, alumni, faculty, teacher is aware of any violations that they know about, they could contact me. I'd be happy to evaluate it, file a complaint under my name, help somebody file a complaint under their name. But I think it's really important for the public to really address and hold schools and K through 12 public schools accountable to their legal obligation. And I'd be happy to help in any way I can to make that happen.
Yeah, I think we've seen again and again how exposure really can make a big difference. But Mark Perry, thank you again for sharing your perspectives and the important work that you do. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Liz.
That will do it for this episode of Liz Collin Reports. We'll see you next time.